Welcome to Season 8 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from around the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. So welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I am joined by the one and only Dr. Paul Zak, who is an influential TED speaker, media personality, and tech entrepreneur. His most recent company, Immersion Neuroscience, is a software platform that allows anyone to measure what the brain loves in real time to improve outcomes in entertainment, education and training, advertising, and live events. His research has identified the brain processes that support virtuous behaviors such as trustworthiness, generosity, and sacrifice, as well as those whose absence leads to evil, vice, and conflict. And that research has been used by the World Bank to stimulate prosperity in developing countries and businesses to enhance economic performance. We're going to unpack that. Just hold tight. Paul has appeared on a variety of shows: Good Morning America, Dr. Phil, Fox and Friends, ABC Evening News, and his work has been covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Time, The Economist, Scientific American, Forbes, Fast Company, and many, many, many others. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you so much, Anita. What a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, same. I'm really excited about this conversation. So could you please, because I'm very curious myself, to tell us what that work with the World Bank was all about?
It was. So I did work in the late 90s, early 2000s, showing that interpersonal trust was among the strongest predictors that economists have ever found to identify why some countries are rich, why they have high living standards, why other countries are poor. And so that's a new dimension, right? We go, okay, well, it's a lot about the humans and how the humans are organized. So in this work, we identified the kind of institutional structures, so both formal legal institutions and also informal social institutions that facilitated high trust in countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and inhibited trust in countries like Colombia, Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, go through the list. And so that was great. And I said, great, how do we measure this? How do we, create more trust in these countries to help stimulate living standards? Awesome. And inevitably, I would get this question that said, well, in a given environment, why do two strangers ever trust each other? And at first I would say, well, I've told you a lot about environments, how to create an environment where this happens. And then you get this, as a researcher, get this thing where like, man, I got to take a shower because I am BSing, out my butt. So that's the deep question that I spent, more than 20 years really to understand is for a given environment, for you and me, we're sitting in the same room. Why would you ever even allow me to talk to you? I mean, it's weird, right? But if you think about the fear issue, how do we balance the desire to interact socially as social creatures with the fear that, hey, I don't know this person and they could be dangerous or they could hurt me or, whatever those things are. And so, the fear part, as is easy. It's easy to say in the lab, right? You can do this and raise your heart rate. That's a piece of cake. How do I measure this good behavior? And so that led me into studying the underlying neurochemistry and neuroelectrical signals associated with positive social behaviors. And what was the big driver? Empathy.
Okay, so we're going to get to the neuroscience in just a second, but what you just described is so fascinating to me because the first thing that comes to mind is I love talking to strangers on an airplane or in a taxi cab, right? So what is it about that? I met my wife on an airplane.
I met my wife on an airplane. Yeah, true story.
Oh, I love that. Okay, fantastic. Maybe we'll circle back to that in a sec. The other thing it reminds me of is from a business perspective is, the first president of eBay, Jeffrey, why am I blanking on his name? He's got a Center for Social Entrepreneurship at Oxford. It's going to Jeff Skoll, one of my heroes. He said initially the business model, people were like, investors were thinking, strangers are going to send each other things and then are going to send each other money. Like that's never going to happen. And he says, no, I trust the goodwill of people. And he turned out to be absolutely correct. So I feel like what you're talking about is not only, true anecdotally in our lives, but actually does have like a real major implication in terms of economics as things bore out with your research.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the world gets interesting, right? I don't grow my own food, right? I depend on doing some kind of work that people pay me for, and I take these worthless pieces of paper and exchange them for food and clothing and housing and all that. And so we are almost a super organism, we the humans, which requires that I have to have something in my head that says, Anita, safe, but your producer, Bob, I'm making this up, sketchy dude. I want to stay away from him. So again, we know that grossly from, say, body movements. I remember going to the grocery store near my house with my daughter, who was, I don't know, 15 at the time, and seeing this guy with the hood down, and he was like talking to himself, and like, okay, that guy's schizophrenic. And I remember just even unconsciously moving my daughter behind me. So I was like, he was walking this way, I'm walking this way. I'm going to make sure that, I'm watching his hands. I'm going to see if this guy's dangerous or not. So I knew that's pretty obvious, right? And my daughter knew exactly what I was doing. I'm keeping her behind me. Like, that's my job as dad, right? Is protect that child. But then what about, ripoffs? What about con men? What about, all the subtle kind of Nigerian prince scams that people fall prey to? Why do we not know? So we have shown actually in recent research that humans are able unconsciously to identify who is going to cheat them in advance. And we can predict that with very high accuracy using neurologic data. But when you ask people on self-report, do you think this person is trustworthy? Because most people that we choose to be around are in fact trustworthy, people just say, oh yeah, this guy seems fine. But unconsciously, we get this alert signal deep from the brainstem that says, no, something's wrong with this. So this is an example where people are talking and there's $500 on the line, $500 American. So that's like $1,000 Canadian, right? So, right. So there's real money on the line, right? So this is not like, a buck or something. This is serious cash. And you got to figure out if this person is going to play nice with you or not. So I think that really captures what we do in life, which is there are real risks to our personal being. There's risks to our financial resources. And yet it doesn't always work perfectly. So we have done, as you probably know, a lot of work with criminal psychopaths as well. And they have a dysfunction in the underlying neurochemical basis for empathy that leads them to treat other humans as a means to an end, as opposed to a sentient being with feelings and emotions.
So, I find an elephant in the room question popping up really early on in this conversation, which is like, how's America faring? And what's the trend line looking like, given sort of increasing political polarization? And how does that impact our way of discerning people who can be trustworthy or not?
Yeah, so the data for most Western countries, and the U.S. has been unfortunately leading this trend from about 1968 down, has been decreasing what's called generalized trust. If I grab a random person, how much do you think that person is trustworthy? That trend's only been bucked. I mean, the slope has been much less steep, for example, in Canada and some of the Scandinavian countries, but even in developing countries. So there are alternative ways to build trust. First of all, we don't interact with random people. Generally, we choose where we go. I choose where I shop. I choose who I hang out with. And so, it may not be the best possible measure. I do think we have learned to be skeptical, certainly in the U.S. since, Watergate, and I think that was 1974. We're like, oh yeah, politicians, of course they're doing stuff in their own self-interest. They're not helping us necessarily. Maybe they are sometimes, right? So I think that's, in the literature in political science, that's the default, which is if you're a politician, you have your own interests, which may conflict or may correspond with the interest of the general population, and where that breakpoint is quite interesting. So it is a concern. We showed with the study you mentioned that we brought to the World Bank that if generalized trust is less than about 30%, we expect no economic growth at all. The U.S. is very close to that threshold now. So again, I think what the counterbalance that this is again 20-year-old research now, is that now we have online institutions that allow us to have reputational effects like at eBay that help support trustworthy behavior. So we see this in the really rapid economic development in Africa, for example. We have fairly unstable governments, but you have a lot of online mobile banking. Everyone's got a mobile phone. And so you're adopting generally kind of Western standards of fair dealing, which is the only way you can, stay in business longer term.
So fascinating. I mean, isn't this what they refer to as behavioral economics, right? That you're speaking about, right? That it's not just you can run numbers with graphs and surplus and what were the supply and demand. You're talking about like human beings who have, ways of being in the world that we, have to actually really investigate and understand why they're behaving certain ways, right?
No.
No.
I'm really a behavioral neuroscientist. So I think observing behavior means I have to guess what's causing that behavior. And we've done many experiments. We ask people, hey, why'd you do this? Like with the if someone's going to cheat you or not for $500. They can't tell us. And this is where identifying brain activity that allows us to get inside your head that you don't even know. So I think many people suffer from what I call the Freudian hangover. We think from this insane guy Freud that if I just poke you enough ways, I can make the unconscious conscious. And that's not the way your brain works. Most brain activity is unconscious. You're not aware of it. And there's no way to get that consciously promoted. So I think the problem, in my view of behavioral economics, is these logical leaps of assumption. Well, you're making a mistake because this and that, right? So here's a concrete example. In the behavioral economics world, as I understand it, if you go to the grocery store and you're hungry and you buy donuts and, I don't know, pork rinds or whatever is, sugary and fatty, behavioral economists say, oh, you're making irrational or bad decisions. From a neuroscience or biological perspective, that's exactly what your body needs, right? We have receptors that measure glucose levels continuously in our brain and motivate us to keep those glucose levels at a stable rate, right? Glucose is the fuel for the body and the brain. So that's exactly to be expected from neuroscience. So I always privilege neurologic data over any other data I get, and we always link it to behavior because brain activity is changing at millisecond frequency. So my problem with behavioral economics is that when you see these potentially irrational behaviors, the assumption is that the human is stupid in some way. Irrational means stupid, right? But when we look at brain activity, we actually see the reasons why people behave differently in the same situation. And that's where life gets interesting, right? Where you see, oh, I put 20 people in this situation and I see 8 or 9 different patterns of behavior. And that to me is what I call the dirty secret of neuroscience, which is when we run experiments, the variation in brain activity around the mean is enormous, even though we often do the analysis about comparing the means of conditions. So that variation means that humans are weird. We're all kind of different for a bunch of reasons. Our glucose is high, our estrogen is low, our testosterone is high, and that gets us to really interesting behaviors that we get to interact with and makes life interesting.
Well, and also provides a perfect segue to actually ask you about the neurological basis for empathy. So I've spoken to neuroscientists and I love this kind of conversation because it's fascinating. So what have you learned?
Right. So we started studying this again about 20 years ago, and we asked whether we could identify an underlying neurochemical substrate for trust, for these prosocial behaviors, cooperative behaviors. And from the animal literature, there was a very rich literature on oxytocin, a neurochemical that all mammals make that's associated with bonding, with connection. And in animals, you drill into the skull and sample the spinal fluid. And Anita, I don't know a ton about humans. I'm just guessing they don't want me to drill into their skulls. So just a guess there. So we developed a protocol, the first protocol to measure the acute production of oxytocin in human beings, doing very rapid blood draws and some special handling of these samples. And we found indeed that when someone trusts you, and in fact, when someone shows you almost any positive social interaction, a kindness, a helping behavior, that the receiver's brain produces oxytocin and it motivates reciprocal helping behaviors. And what's the subjective psychological state of that? Empathy. So it's empathy. So you help me and I go, oh, now I get this feeling state that is correlated with my neurologic state, which is my preference always, that, I feel what we call empathic concern. I feel connected to you. You've helped me and now I want to help you in return. Now, this is where we get into like conning people out of their money, right? So in most cons, the con man or con woman shows they want to give help at first, and it draws into that oxytocin given empathic concern that I want to then reciprocate that helping behavior. So again, we always have to be a little bit on guard, but once we had this tool, we could ask so many different questions about why we cry at movies, why some advertisements motivate us to purchase a product. Right? All this is about social connection, about not just oxytocin, but a suite of neurochemicals that tell us that the experience is so valuable that we want to invest in extending this experience. And that extension often involves helping behaviors.
Do you think most people know how good it feels to actually be in sort of like an empathic exchange? Because I see that the trend lines are also downward on just empathy generally in society, especially among youth, that we're becoming less and less empathic. And yet there's so much benefit in being empathic and exchanging empathy between people. I wonder if you could comment.
Sure. Let's talk about the neurochemical effects of that. So when I see a helping behavior often, but not always, and that's all the research we had to do is what inhibits or promotes oxytocin release. Like this release of oxytocin, that induces a release of dopamine, this neurochemical that gives us this little mood boost, like, oh, this is awesome. This feels great. All right. So dopamine is the same neurochemical that, is increased millionfold when people take methamphetamine or cocaine. So it's a little cocaine hit, like, wow, This is awesome. Also induces, at least weekly, the release of serotonin, which reduces anxiety. We feel more comfortable around this person. So you're right, there's a real feeling of benefit from this. But we get it all the time. My dog's lying at my feet here, and we've shown that if you pet a dog or a cat, more a dog than a cat, but cats can do it as well, that the human and the animal release oxytocin reciprocally. So what's more fun than holding a puppy? I mean, to think about, it's almost more fun than holding an infant, It's like, oh my God, a puppy, like that's the best experience. So we all have that, or almost all of us have that. So by the way, we find about 5% of the population don't get this oxytocin response, this empathy response. And about half those individuals are people having a really bad day. And I think this is important for listeners. So high levels of stress inhibit that oxytocin-driven empathic response. These are not bad people. These are good people having a bad day. And what do they need from us? More care, more concern, more love, right? Now, the other half of those, between 2 and 3%, are people who, through genetics and through life experience, look like psychopaths. So psychopaths classically lack empathy, and they just don't get this feeling state like all of us do. They can hold a puppy and think, oh, I can break its neck. It doesn't bother me. Or I can use a human being take money or sex or drugs. And it just doesn't, hurting people just doesn't, they don't get that bad feeling that we get because of empathy. And so I've argued in my 2012 book, The Moral Molecule, that oxytocin is a substrate for moral behavior or appropriate social behavior. Because if I'm empathic and I hurt you, I would feel so bad, Anita. Imagine if I did something that hurt you physically, emotionally, I would feel terrible. And almost all of us do. So the good news is that, 97, 98% of the population, things are going fine. Their brains are working fine, including we've measured patients with severe trauma histories as children, sexually abused women. And this system is really deep in the brainstem, evolutionarily conserved. And so for about half these women, even with years and years of abuse, this connection system is intact. For the other ones, really, they need therapy and drugs to help them, have appropriate social connections. But, we should be tolerant, right? We all have bad days, and bad days are going to inhibit the underlying neurologic substrates that allow us to be empathic, allow us to be good connectors, good friends, good spouses, good parents, good employees.
Today's episode was brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies.
You remind me of an incident that happened to me as I was learning about the neuroscience of empathy. This is more than a decade ago, where I was in a lineup at a FedEx counter. This is pre-mobile phones. I didn't have anything to distract me. I was waiting for like more than half hour. By the time I got to the counter, the woman who greeted me was just rude. I mean, really unnecessarily mean. And I remember having had a reaction of like, how dare she? And I almost wanted to like challenge her, but then I gave it a second and I actually looked at her with intention and said, "Are you okay?" Mm-hmm. And when she realized that I was not being sarcastic and that I was being sincere, she burst into tears and told me about her child at home sick, that she'd been working double shifts for 2 weeks. She hadn't had lunch. It was 3 p.m. She was tired, exhausted, and hungry. And, just the humanity that opened up for us. So it's an anecdote I like to share with people, that it's always accessible to us to, like, create the space and flex your empathy muscles. But what I heard you say about this, like 5% and half of whom are having a bad day, aren't more of us in our society having more bad days than normal? And during COVID, like, all of us have had really bad days almost all the time. So isn't there like a generalized sense of like, how can we counter the way our brains are captured by stress hormones instead of oxytocin and serotonin? Like, what can we do deliberately in order to kind of like come out of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know, whether things are getting better or worse. I do know in lockdown, when my nearly adult children returned home, that I just told them, all I want to do is give you one hug a day, right? That's all. I'm not going to bother you. You're in school. You got stuff to do. So as you said, it's easy enough to reach out to people just to say, are you okay? Is there something I can do to help you? So one of my rules is I try to end every conversation with the word service. Say, how can I be of service to you? Mm. Right? So first of all, some people are happy to have that. A lot of people don't take me up on it, but some people who do, you start to build a relationship. So neurologically, we are designed to build relationships, and we should just embrace that. Here's something fun you said, flex that empathy muscle. So like all brain processes, our ability to be empathic, to release oxytocin, is trainable. We can get better at it. So I decided some years ago to talk to people in elevators. It's really weird to sit in a box for, 20 or 40 or 60 seconds and not say hello to people. The other people know you're there. You're not transparent. And so I've had the most interesting conversations in elevators, although half the people are totally freaked out that I say hi to them. And that also makes me happy for some reason. So, I think it's okay. We can say hello. I love what you did at FedEx. Just, are you okay? Is there something I can get you? Or, and that trains us to be better connectors, more empathic to the people that we want to be around. And so part of it is what you did something very interesting, and we should call that out to the listeners, that you stopped and reflected, right? And so oftentimes that kind of knee-jerk, this person to whatever, bad person, and, and I want to, return kind with kind. It's really looking inside and go, oh, this poor lady's got to be having a really bad day. So I don't know about you, Anita, but I've worked with a lot of psychiatric patients, and I'm so used to weirdo behavior, it's what we call abnormal. It's okay. Their brains are just working differently. And that's all of us. That's you and me when we haven't slept for 24 hours. It's you and me when we haven't had a meal. Mm. I think of, on airplanes, I travel a lot, and you see some bad behavior on airplanes. And generally it's people who are fine people in their normal lives, but they've been flying for 24 hours, or they just don't feel good because they've been in the air so long, and that's okay. I think it's all right. I mean, I don't want to say be a pushover and let people abuse you. No, that's not appropriate. But if we can in my brain at least, I try to refocus that into, why would this person be behaving badly when we got 5 more hours to sit next to each other? Mm-hmm. Maybe they're a bad person, but probably they're having some kind of problem, and maybe I can help them. Maybe I can get them a drink of water. How hard is that?
Exactly. And, one of the questions I wanted to ask, but now seems like an appropriate time, especially since you've already given a few examples. Like, I wanted to ask you, based on all of the research that you've done over the years, how have you as a person changed? How have you been changed by it? How have your relationships changed? I mean, let me just reiterate some of the tips that I just heard in short succession. One was a hug a day. That's easy to do with any family member. The other one, you ended something with, how can I be of service? I love that. That's the second tip. And now you've just finished talking about how you can reframe a situation where you can actually, recognize a behavior that may be off-putting, but how can you reframe it so that you can extend empathy? So I hear those 3 things. What else are some of the ways that you've integrated your learning, and how have you changed as a person in your own life?
It's a good question. And I think you have to believe your own research, or you're just full of crap. So, I'm a big nerd, and I am an introvert, so I can spend 12 hours in my lab, not talk to anybody. But I realized that that's not emotionally healthy. It impairs your happiness and your physical health. And so I started spending more time investing in relationships. And so some years ago, I turned 50. I had 4 surprise birthday parties. Never had that in my life. And I think that's an investment. It's not because I'm so awesome. It's because I had invested in relationships. I put time into those relationships. I served the people in those relationships. So I really think it's about service. I think I've become a much nicer person because of that, more tolerant, more thoughtful, even with difficult people. The Dalai Lama said that we should celebrate difficult people because they give us a chance to practice true compassion. Right? It's easy to be compassionate with people that you see every day or your family, but what about like the FedEx lady, that kind of thing, like, oh, that's an opportunity. That's a chance for me to grow and really practice true empathy. So I love that your focus on purposeful empathy. I think that's important. So I try to be purposefully empathic. I can't speak, but you got what I'm trying to say. And then lastly, tip is, I'm a big believer in using the L word. You can tell the people around them that you love them, including people that you work with in the philia sense, or your friends, right? How wonderful is it when you get a phone call from a friend who says, Anita, I love you. Like, wow, that was my dog barking. Speaking of love. Hey, are you getting the dog barking or no?
No.
Okay, perfect. So I try to tell people around me that I love them. And if they know me well enough, they recognize that. Often I mean that in the philia sense, not in the romantic sense. Also, when you have gray hair like me, then you can get away. I'm not, scamming on anybody. So almost everyone I work with, I told them I love them. I try to do it regularly, not every day, because then it becomes just like I'm saying, like, I love you on the phone, but it's got to be important. Like, I really love you. I really care about you. So really investing in human beings as human beings and their beautiful flaws and wonderful, unusual, strange behaviors. Try to tell one person a day you love them. How nice is that?
I'm getting from you. Do you know the work of Mary Gordon at Roots of Empathy, where she brings babies into the classroom? She's fabulous. I'll send you a link. I interviewed her for my PhD, and she brings babies into classrooms to teach children about emotion. She calls it emotional literacy, like learning how to express their feelings. And a new baby comes in September and comes once a month throughout the entire academic year. And then in the next year of the grade, they have different age appropriate curriculum. So there's a new baby, every year. And those Roots of Baby schools, and they exist all over the world now, bullying has dropped off. It's almost absent from those schools because children have developed such a capacity to express themselves and care for one another, just thanks to this little innovation of a baby in a classroom. But the reason why I'm bringing up Mary Gordon is that when I interviewed her, we were seated in person in Toronto, where she's based. And I remember taking off the sweater I was wearing, even though it was like a November day, cold in Canada, because she emanated so much warmth. And even on a Zoom call, I can just sense like how much warmth you emanate. And you just seem like such a happy, satisfied with life kind of person, like a real mensch. So thank you for sharing those tips.
Oh, you're so sweet. Mensch is one of my favorite words. So that's a huge compliment in my book. I do think if you're a selfish person, the best thing you can do to be more satisfied in your life is to help others, because you will get so much benefit from that. So I'm not saying I'm a selfish person, but I'm just saying if you're smart about living a longer and healthier and happier life, you really do have to be of service to others. And so I'm happy that I seem to be giving that off. Hopefully I can live up to those kind words every day.
Well, okay. So luminaries have said exactly what you've said, but let me ask you, do you have any research that shows that empathy makes people happier?
Yeah, we do actually. We have a ton of research that shows empathy makes people happier. It's really very powerful, not only happier, but improve the quality of life, the length of life, health span. So it's really important. And part of the work we're doing now is creating technologies to measure the peak experiences that individuals can have. So when you have those peak experiences, you really improve the quality of your life. So it's not just having lots of social experiences, having really powerful ones, again, with those people that you love.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned something about measuring empathy. How do you measure empathy?
Right. So again, I privilege data over self-report data because it's very difficult for me to quantify sometimes, how empathic my feelings are. So the original way we measured it was blood draws. We did before and after blood draws after an experience to measure the change in oxytocin, which again correlates with empathy on self-report. Then we developed technologies that capture the value you get from this experience. And I call that neurologic state immersion. And that has to do with both dopamine, which is I'm measuring whether I'm present to the experience. Am I actually here? And then will I getting this oxytocin-driven empathic response? And we can now measure that with an app on a smartwatch or fitness sensor. So it allows subscribers to our software to measure what people's brains love in real time, any place people are doing interesting things. So you didn't mention my high point of my media career, which is being on The Bachelor and on ABC TV and actually measuring the connection between The Bachelor and I think 6 or 7 of the original women in the group. And so, that's not a business I want to be in, but it is a fun application of that. And even my dog here, who's now panting and making noise next to me, we can actually measure how much my dog is valuing the experience he has with myself and the other humans in the family. So this is a very universal kind of need by mammals, that is to congregate with others, particularly social mammals like humans. And then having a technology that lets us measure the value of those experiences, again, as you said, from movies to advertisements to K-12 education, right? Those are all social experiences. So let's just make them better, and we can make them better by measuring.
Okay, so penultimate question before our final conclusion. This has been such a delicious conversation. I know you feel distracted by the dog, but I am like hooked on every word. So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. And I don't know if you're doing much research in this space or thinking in this space, but with the advent of AI and robotics and machines that are getting closer and closer to sentient, I mean, they're anthropomorphizing, right? And we already have research showing that men would date robots and even have sex with androids that can have sex already in 50 some odd positions. What do you think? I mean, when you're talking about the neurological underpinning of empathy, there will be no such thing in a machine. So what's the computer human being interface, and what are the realities and limitations of how far empathy can go with that?
That's an excellent question. Gosh. So we actually have done some research and writing about this. So have you ever cried at a movie?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. A lot of times. That's weird. That's a 2D experience. Why would you cry at a movie? It's because we get immersed in the experience. We transport ourselves into that world. And I think with augmented reality and virtual reality and AI technology, it's even more transportive. That is, it seems more realistic to us. So our brains are just cued for empathy. We're set up. Again, neuroanatomically, we have many more receptors for oxytocin than any other mammals. We are just primed for social experiences. So the upside of what you've just mentioned is that if I'm in a VR space where I have great social connections with avatars and I'm training my brain to release more oxytocin, then outside of that experience in the real world, I may be much better at releasing oxytocin and therefore being more empathic and a better connector. We have some evidence to suggest that. Some evidence in humans, very good evidence in rodents, that once you release oxytocin, you kind of prime the pathways and you make it easier. So again, in my own experience, once I invested in relationships, it's really easy for me to hang out and meet people now, even though I'm an introverted nerd and by personality don't generally want to do that. Hence talking to people in elevators. That's self-training, right? I'm almost doing that for me just because I need the help. But the second is, if we make these augmented or virtual reality experiences so compelling, and we have chatbots, avatars that can sense our need for emotional connection, we may not want to leave that world. We may spend more and more time in that world. So the contrary evidence for the upside is Japan. So I've been in Japan a number of times recently. And when you see, men on the subway reading pornographic magazines, and yet there are no babies, right? So, I mean, I was in Japan for a week with my daughter. We literally saw one child, one crowd on the stroller, and we were just shocked. There are no babies there. They're not reproducing. So these from what I've read, is spending, particularly the men, are spending so much time looking at pornography, using sex bots or whatever, that they're not actually connecting to the real women around them. Because, humans are complicated. We've established that. It makes them interesting. It also makes them frustrating, right? If you're married, your spouse has frustrated you. If you have a partner, they do. We love them. They still frustrate the heck out of us because normal humans have friction, right? And it could be because we're having a bad day. Who knows? So in the AR, VR world, those frictions largely disappear, right? So I think we ought to be very careful as a society, and that may be limiting how much time people spend in there, particularly young people. I don't think the experience is the same, although the brain may view it as the same. Mm-hmm. So I think it takes a little bit of self-control to go, hey, that was fun. It's like watching Netflix or whatever streaming service, Hulu. You can spend your whole day doing that. There's an infinite variety. It's probably not the best use of your time, right? You probably should interact with humans. You should work. You should do other things that give you satisfaction, make you feel like you've accomplished something. I think that's really important for humans. A sense of purpose and meaning is also very important to improving satisfaction with life. So I don't think you're going to get a lot of that in the AR, VR world, unless like you're mining in there, or you're doing something. You're mining for Bitcoin. Maybe that's satisfying. I don't know.
Okay, we're on the same wavelength about that. I totally agree with the sort of, a little bit of concern about where the direction of technology is going and what that means for us as human beings. Paul, I want to ask one final question. You've been super generous with your time. I love ending my conversations by asking a personal question, and that is, can you think of a time in your life, small, medium, large, recent, long time ago, doesn't matter, where you were on the receiving end of what I call purposeful empathy? You knew the person was there to be empathic for you, and what that meant for you.
I got a chance to interact with a neuroscientist and a Buddhist monk named Mathieu Ricard, who's written a couple of books and is known as the happiest man in the world, at a TED conference a number of years ago in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And we had a mind melt. And so much so that he was about to give his TED talk, and they were trying to pull him away. And they said, "Oh, we have to do his hair." And I said, "No, I don't need to talk to him for 5 minutes longer." And he was so present and so kind and empathic and joyful. And you see these people who just radiate goodness. And so I just met him the first time in my life, talked to him for 5 minutes. I said, "Hair, he's a monk. He's bald." So I rubbed his head. I'm like, "Oh no, he doesn't need hair and makeup. He's beautiful and he's bald." I rubbed this man's head that I'd never met before. Like, that's the kind of connection that I wish all of us could have. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have this deep sense of presence and openness, to be fully there for everybody in our lives? Just the value to that other person, but also to yourself, of having a true, deep connection. And as you said earlier, Anita, once you've had that, it is almost addictive. I want to have that level of connection, even with a stranger, as possible.
Thank you. I feel my dopamine levels have risen in the 42 minutes we've spent together. I want to thank you so much, Paul, for all of the wisdom and expertise you've imparted to our viewers and listeners. Thank you so much for joining, everyone, and we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free from your thinking clutter and make important decisions and liberate you from whatever is holding you back? At Grand Huron International, you get to choose the coach of your choice, anytime, from anywhere. Visit grandhuroninternational.com and harness the power of on-demand coaching today.